Lindsay says, I'm Paris. I'm Senior Curator of Art at Imperial War Museums. My normal day-to-day job covers the Cold War and late 20th century conflict, so from the dates from about 1949 to 2000. So you're probably now thinking, why is she talking to us about the Second World War? Well, I have a personal interest, particularly in aviation. And so when we were thinking about commemorating 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain and looking at our art collection, my two kind of passions together, aviation and art, it was too much of a good opportunity to pass over. So I was very lucky to be involved. So as I say, 2020 marks the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. Imperial War Museums has done a lot to commemorate this anniversary, and you can now see a website on your screen, and if you follow this, then you'll be able to see articles and videos and all kinds of projects that we have been doing. That includes one of our branches, Imperial War Museum, Duxford. We have new displays, so you can see a newly refurbished operations room, and you can also see new exhibitions in one of our hangars through the Battle of Britain. But we want to do something a little bit different and include our art collection in our commemorations. So I had the fantastic responsibility of delving deeper into our Second World War art collection and looking at Battle of Britain themed artworks. So what we thought would be fantastic to do would actually to loan out some of our artworks to other venues. So I selected three, which you will see in this presentation. And thanks to funding from the Art Fund, we have been able to tour those three artworks to different venues. So they went to the Russell Coates Art Gallery and Museum in Bournemouth. They are now currently on display at the Harris, which you will be able to see very soon, I'm sure. And then they will go on tour to two other venues in the new year, being Touchstones Rochdale and the collection in Lincoln. So the first work from our collection, which is currently on loan to the Harris, is An Aerial Battle by Francis Dodd. And this is a kind of aftermath of a dogfight in the Battle of Britain. And then you have a portrait by Thomas Cantrell Dugdale of Squadron Leader Denham, who was awarded the DFC Distinguished Flying Cross. And then you have something a little different, which is a surrealist painting by Eileen Agar, which is untitled. So I will revisit these works in the presentation within the wider context of the Battle of Britain and the Harris's own collection. But first, I would like to explore how artists documented the Second World War in general. So the War Artists Advisory Committee was a government body established by the Ministry of Information. It launched in November 1939 with the purpose of commissioning artists to record the Second World War. The scheme was led by the director of the National Gallery, Sir Kenneth Clarke, and used the model of the official War Artists Initiative from the First World War. Its terms of reference were quite simply to, and I quote here, to draw up a list of artists qualified to record the war at home and abroad, in cooperation with the service departments and other government departments, as may be desirable, to advise on the selection of artists from this list for war purposes, and advise on such questions as copyright, disposal, and exhibition of works, and the publication of reproductions. So that was the War Artists Advisory Committee's remit. So the War Artists Advisory Committee, or WAAC for short, which is how I'll refer to them a little bit easier in the presentation. It consisted of representatives from the Admiralty, the War Office and the Air Ministry. It also included Muirhead Bone, who is shown here painting on board a ship in harbour. He was an official war artist during the First World War and a friend of Kenneth Clarke. A trustee for the Imperial War Museum, Bone had an eye to the future when thinking about where the artworks produced during the scheme might be housed longer term. The Royal College of Art was represented by its principal, Percy Jowett, and the Royal Academy Schools by keeper Walter Russell. The composition of the WAAC changed over the course of the Second World War, with Professor Randolph Schwaber joining from the Slade School of Art in 1941, for example. But Kenneth Clarke remained at the helm for the duration. of the Second World War. The WAAC kept artists in employment during the Second World War and attempted to safeguard them from action on the front line, ensuring that there would be a new generation of artists after the war had ended. Kenneth Clark later wrote in his publication, The Other Half, A Self-Portrait, in 1977, that in creating the committee, he was not so naive as to suppose that he should secure a record of the war that could not be better achieved by photography. He goes on to say that his aim, and I quote, "which of course I did not disclose, was simply to keep artists at work on any pretext and, as far as possible, to prevent them from being killed." By the end of February 1940, 247 artists were recommended for employment by the WAAC, and 141 were on the reserve lists. This increased over the duration of the war. The WAAC gave a selection of artists renewable full-time commissions, usually lasting around 6 months, assigning them to work for the War Office, the Admiralty, the Air Ministry, or the Ministry of Transport. There were 37 of these full-time war artists in total, and they were paid a yearly rate of around £650, which equates to around £36,600 now. They also received allowances such as travel, accommodation, and food. The salary changed in 1943 to include higher allocation for better-known artists. Over £36,000 a year may seem like a healthy wage to us now, but some artists were paid that amount for a single artwork previous to the war. In exchange for their salary, the full-time artists would submit all of their artworks to the WAAC, including any sketches or preparatory drawings. The WAAC collected artwork from over 400 other artists who were given short-term contracts or would make one-off sales or gifts to the scheme. The full-time salaried artists included Eric Kennington, shown here working on a portrait of Flight Lieutenant Mungo Park, but there was also artists such as Stephen Bone, Leslie Cole, William Dring, and Thomas Hennell, all of which are represented in the exhibition at the Harris and are housed in the museum's permanent collection. So you may be thinking, how did they end up being in the Harris? Well, I'll tell you. At the outbreak of war, the decision was made to evacuate the collection at the National Gallery in London, resulting in empty gallery space. From July 1940, the WAAC organised exhibitions of the war artists' work for the public to view, utilising this free space in the National Gallery. As Kenneth Clark was at the helm of the WAAC and the director of the National Gallery, he was in a position to advocate for the use of this space. In this photograph from IWM's collection, the Duke of Gloucester opens the RAF art exhibition at the National Gallery on the 5th of April 1944. Ensuring that the audience for the exhibitions was not limited to residents of London, the scheme toured the artworks to venues across the UK. The attendance at these shows was very high, and the exhibitions provide the public with a source of entertainment and access to culture in the worst of times. For example, a total of 10,584 people visited one of these exhibitions when it toured to the Victoria Art Gallery in Bath in 1942. In 1945, the WAAC exhibited its final display of works, this time at Burlington House in London, as the National Gallery's collection had been returned. Opening on the 13th of October 1945, the exhibition included an astronomical collection of war art, over 1,000 drawings, paintings and prints, and 21 sculptures. Even more works were added into the November. The exhibition had 16,615 visitors in just a 6-week period, which is quite astounding. By the end of December 1945, the WAAC was being disbanded, and a new subcommittee comprising representatives from the IWM, so the Imperial War Museum, and Ministry of Information, was being formed with the task of dispersing the collection of 5,570 artworks, which have been collected through commissions, purchases and gifts. Due to his crossover between the WAAC and Imperial War Museum, Muirhead Bone, who you saw painting on that ship, was appointed as chairman of the subcommittee. He was joined by other previous members of the scheme and 4 representatives from Imperial War Museum. The subcommittee met from January 1946 with the aim of dispersing the artworks as widely as possible so that the scheme and its collection would have a legacy into the future. Many institutions submitted requests for war art for their permanent collections, and the subcommittee met regularly to go through the applications. In total, around half of the near 6,000 artworks were dispersed to museums across the UK and the Commonwealth, and the other half were added to the Imperial War Museum's collection, which also included the archive containing all correspondence with war artists throughout the Second World War. So if you're ever researching any war artists, Imperial War Museum is a place to get in touch with. The letter here is from the art director and curator of the Harris Museum and Art Gallery, on lovely headed paper, quite jealous of that. He'd visited the WAAC's final exhibition at Burlington House in London and wished to request a list of works for the Harris's permanent collection. The list included works by war artists John Armstrong, James Bateman, Stephen Bone, Leslie Cole, William Dring, Richard Urich, Thomas Hennell, Laura Knight and John Worsley, all of which are now in the permanent collection of the Harris. They were all accepted by the WAAC, by the subcommittee, as the list. You can see the majority of these works on display in the fantastic exhibition at the Harris. So I'm now going to share some of my particular highlights of these works alongside some of Imperial War Museum's collection. Hopefully this will be a feast for the eyes for a Wednesday evening. So in Burnt Out Aeroplane, the artist John Armstrong depicts a crashed Italian bomber, a Savoia Marchetti SM-79. I can see people nodding, they know this aircraft. The WAAC commissioned Armstrong to create 2 paintings of this type of aircraft. The other, entitled September 1940, is now in the Manchester City Art Gallery. Before the war, Armstrong had relied on income from commercial galleries, but when this work diminished, he welcomed employment from the WAAC. This photograph from Imperial War Museum's collection shows the same type of aircraft depicted in Armstrong's painting and was taken in 1941. The aircraft itself has a distinctive hump above the cockpit. It has an elongated nose towards the propeller, and you can see there's quite distinctive ribbing on the fuselage. Looking back at Armstrong's work, you can see that he captures all of these elements. He's paid delicate attention to the technological design of the aircraft. So you can see the hump, the elongated nose towards the now bent propeller, and you can see that the skeleton of the aircraft and the fuselage is what would have caused that ribbing. The landscape in the foreground of Armstrong's work is quite sandy coloured, and it changes to blue-black towards the horizon. And it gives me the sense that this aircraft is being shown as a kind of beached whale. You know, its bones are now exposed and its entire being motionless. This gouache on paper is by John Armstrong, and it's in Imperial War Museum's collection. It dates from 1940. In this scene, he shows a view across the floor of an aircraft factory where men are working on the structure of 2 aircraft. The Harris's painting from just a year later suggests that Armstrong used his acquired knowledge on the processes involved in manufacturing aircraft to depict the structure of the Italian bomber with very accurate and detailed execution. Another artwork on the Harris's list was James Bateman's painting Women's Land Army at Work. Known more colloquially as Land Girls, the Women's Land Army, or WLA, were female volunteers who worked in agriculture, contributing to the country's food production. The Women's Land Army was first formed in the First World War, but was revived at the start of the Second World War, their numbers expanding from around 1,000 in 1939 to 80,000 in 1944. Here, Bateman has shown members of the Women's Land Army filling up pig pen troughs for feeding time. The WAAC wanted to ensure that artists recorded all aspects of the home fronts and commissioned artwork which reflected work on the land. Approximately 60 paintings and drawings produced through the scheme showed home front activities, depicting farm work in particular. Agriculture as a subject matter was more widely documented than other forms of production, such as shipbuilding or aircraft manufacturing, and this is reflective of the growth of this type of work during a short period of time. So before the Second World War, Britain had imported large amounts of quantities of its food, but that was no longer possible. That, coupled with the desire to reflect the change in women's roles during the war, resulted in a large collection of artworks depicting women working on rustic activities, essentially. In this photograph, dating from around 1940 from Imperial War Museum's collection, 2 members of the Women's Land Army are clearing out a pigsty. And this is probably at the Women's Land Army Training Centre, which is at Cannington Farm in Somerset. So this is why they learned how to do these types of things. So in this painting, Bateman has shown 3 members of the Women's Land Army dressed in yellow overalls and rubber boots on. And you can see that the figure at the back is actually pouring some food into a bucket. And then the figure at the centre is carrying 2 full buckets towards the 3rd figure, who is already emptying some into one of the troughs. So there's a kind of production line underway here. So if you look at the pigs, not one of them is looking away from the women, or should I say the buckets. They certainly know it's feeding time. The larger 3 pigs on the left-hand side are shown leaning over the barriers. Their mouths are drooling and their trotters are hanging over the edge quite impatiently. Bateman, coming from a farming family in Kendal in Cumbria, would have known all too well what feeding time in a pigsty was like. And you can see his acute personal and somewhat humorous observations are reflected here. At the outbreak of war in 1939, artist Thomas Hennell wrote to the WAAC offering his services. At the start of his commission, like Bateman, Hennell documented rural scenes and agriculture, but from July 1943 he was posted to Iceland. He replaced fellow war artist and close friend Eric Revilius after he had been tragically killed in an air rescue mission off the Icelandic coast in September the previous year. From early January 1944, he was then back in England painting fishing and shipbuilding activities in the northeast. But in May, he was commissioned by the Admiralty to document preparations for D-Day, the Allied invasion in Normandy, in Portsmouth. He went on to accompany invasion troops on D-Day and spent the next few months with the Canadian First Army in northern France. Hennell travelled to the coastal town of Boulogne-sur-Mer and documented the devastation caused by the Allied air and artillery bombardment, which had been launched to weaken German defences in the town. In this watercolour, Hennell shows the remains of the church of Saint-Pierre, surrounded by destruction. An overturned cart can be seen at the bottom centre, and 2 figures, presumably carrying belongings, are walking towards the church on the left-hand side. The grey-black skies reflect the overall mood of the scene that Hennell is witnessing. This is a watercolour in Imperial War Museum's collection by Hennell, also depicting Boulogne, but this time this is the ruins of the Galerie de Paris. There is a group of British soldiers to the left and a single British non-commissioned officer to the right, and they're sitting amongst the rubble. The painting is a mass of twisted, rusty girders, the roof having completely collapsed. Shortly after his time in Boulogne, Hennell went to Belgium and Holland before being posted to the Far East. He arrived in Burma, which is now Myanmar, in June 1945 before travelling to India, Sri Lanka and Singapore. After this, Hennell went to Surabaya in Java in November 1945, and it is here that he was reported missing. It is thought that he was captured and later killed by Indonesian nationalist fighters during the Indonesian War of Independence. Hennell is pictured here in a photograph from Imperial War Museum's collection on board the HMS Hunter on his way to Penang in Malaysia in 1945. He was one of just 3 war artists to lose their lives during the Second World War, one being Erik Villiers, from whom he took over in Iceland, and the other being Albert Richards, who is also represented in the exhibition at the Harris. John Worsley was a midshipman in the Royal Naval Reserve before being appointed as a full-time war artist in 1943. He recorded activities in the Mediterranean, witnessing the Allied invasion of Italy in September 1943, but he was then captured and held prisoner of war in a camp in Germany called Marlag O. And you can see that this picture here shows Marlag O covered in snow. In this watercolour on display at the Harris, Worsley shows the extent of the prisoner of war complex. Marlag O was a compound specifically for officers and their orderlies, but the whole Marlag site had a total of 29 single-storey huts, and you can see these in the background as those green buildings. There was even a camp theatre where POWs, prisoners of war, could perform concerts and plays. Imperial War Museums holds a number of Worsley's works from his time as a POW at Marlag O. He documented the interiors of huts, the perimeter fence and watchtower of the camp, escape tunnels, and even cricket matches between Marlag O and the nearby Millag Nord camp, which mainly housed members of the Merchant Navy. And you can see one of these cricket matches is underway in this watercolour here. But my personal favourite, however, and befitting of this month, is his watercolour entitled Decorating the Christmas Tree. Much better Christmas tree than the one behind me. If you can see, I've only got a mini one this year. You can see in this watercolour, Lieutenant Houston Rogers is shown playing a whistle, while Lieutenant Blondie Muse decorates the tree behind him. It was for Blondie Muse that Worsley, adept in forgery, made Albert a life-size dummy in order to help him escape the camp. This has since been made into a film called Albert RN. I don't know if any of you have seen that, but I would recommend looking at these watercolours and watching that film. It's a fantastic comparison. Moving back into the Mediterranean now and to the island of Malta. And this was of strategic importance during the Second World War and was consequently heavily attacked by the German forces, notably between June 1940 and November 1942. However, Malta held and survived the siege, and the WAAC decided to send war artist Leslie Cole to document the Allied effort. Cole particularly enjoyed observing the Maltese inhabitants who had done so much towards the defence of the island. But in this work entitled Malta RAF Bomb Dump, Cole presents a bomb store with the ordnance concealed by a variety of camouflaged webbing. At the centre of the scene, branches from a tree have been enveloped in thick netting with piles of bombs underneath. Positioned next to a heavily fortified wall, every effort has gone into hiding the store from aerial reconnaissance. This watercolour by Cole in Imperial War Museum's collection makes for an interesting comparison. The concealed bombs are located next to a well-used winding road, which appears to lead to a fortified observation post looking out over sea and low-flying aircraft, if you can see right at the top of the work. A figure is walking up the road towards the lookout, seemingly carrying something heavy up the steep hill. Cole not only records what he is observing, but Cole not only records what he is observing in Malta, but his colour palette of sandy yellows and these bright blues evokes the very essence of the Mediterranean. A few years earlier, in 1941, Cole created this watercolour, now in Imperial War Museum's collection. He has shown 2 members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or WAAF for short, repairing a barrage balloon. One woman kneels, tying thread, while the other woman, lying on her side, looks on. They appear to be inside the balloon, with their only source of light being the bright lantern at the centre. The bulbous interior of the balloon makes this space magical. The shadows seem to dance as your eyes move around the scene. I must admit, it reminds me of when I was a child and I would climb into my duvet cover and then get lost on the way out. I hope I'm not alone in admitting that. Operated by RAF Balloon Command, barrage balloons were used to protect cities, docks and shipping yards from air attack. They forced German aircraft to operate at higher altitudes, reducing the accuracy of their bombing, and they made dive bombing almost impossible. This photograph from our collection shows the factory floor at the Dunlop Balloon Factory in Manchester, where barrage balloons were constructed. And here, members of the WAAF, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, learn how to handle a barrage balloon at the training centre at RAF Cardington in Bedfordshire. At around 19 metres long and 8 metres in diameter, and part filled with hydrogen, the balloons could be extremely unwieldy and hard to control. Once in position, the balloons were attached with cables and could float as high as 5,000 feet above the ground. In this painting from Imperial War Museum's collection, renowned war artist Dame Laura Knight depicts a balloon being hoisted into position at a balloon site in Coventry in 1943. Knight has shown the Coventry skyline in the background, if you can see there, just above the heads of the women. And you can see that many of the buildings have been damaged by air attack. So surrounding the city with barrage balloons was a way of preventing this from happening again. Coventry was a target for the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe as it's known, because the city had many factories and businesses which were crucial to the war effort. The city's historic streets and buildings were also destroyed by the air raids, and even Coventry Cathedral was left in ruins. Astoundingly, the cathedral's spire survived, and you can see it in the centre of the painting, just above the second woman to the right. In this painting from the Harris's collection, Laura Knight shows several members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force repairing a barrage balloon at RAF Whittle, the headquarters of No. 6 Barrage Balloon Centre, which was responsible for the balloon defence of Birmingham. The group of women each have a role. Some are shown stitching, some gluing, some supporting the material. The enormity of the task is reflected in the scale of the balloon in comparison to the women, and the creases and folds of the balloon material evoke the collapse of something like a big top at the circus, which was actually a subject that Laura Knight was familiar with. The WAAC were hugely impressed by Knight's work and used her paintings for publicity and recruitment throughout the war. Nearly 1,500 barrage balloons were deployed during the Battle of Britain in 1940. If you look carefully, you can see several in this painting by Francis Dodd. And this is the first of the 3 Battle of Britain themed loans from the Imperial War Museums currently on display at the Harris. The Battle of Britain provided a spectacle of the kind never seen before. During the summer and autumn of 1940, swirling dogfights between the RAF Fighter Command and German Air Force, or Luftwaffe, took place in the skies over southern England, captivating those observing on the ground. The weaving white contrails of iconic aircraft, including the Supermarine Spitfire, the Hawker Hurricane, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, became the focus for a group of artists who endeavoured to capture the sight, but also the feeling of this major air campaign. Francis Dodd presents a more kind of domestic view of the Battle of Britain in An Aerial Battle, which is dated very specifically as the 6th of September 1940. Francis Dodd served as a war artist in both the First and Second World Wars. He lived in Blackheath in southeast London, an area which he repeatedly drew and painted until his death in 1949. It could be that this scene is taken from his back garden in Blackheath. In Dodd's painting, a black cat sits on a garden wall, seemingly unaware of the recent aerial dogfight which has taken place in the skies above. The aircraft themselves are not visible, but their fading, interlaced contrails reveal the tight manoeuvres made between the RAF and the Luftwaffe. And just beyond the trellis wall is a row of bushy trees, which are heavy with the green foliage, having not yet turned the autumnal colours synonymous with September. And floating just above them are several of these white barrage balloons. Dodd's painting conveys the simultaneous proximity and distance of the Battle of Britain. Aerial combat and defences are evident in the sky, but life seems to go on below. The painting Battle of Britain by Paul Nash is arguably the most famous interpretation of the Battle of Britain by a war artist, and it's in Imperial War Museum's art collection. Like Francis Dodd, Paul Nash had served as an official war artist during the First World War, and by 1940 he was one of Britain's most prominent artists. He was fascinated by aerial warfare and produced Battle of Britain in 1941, which was purchased by the WAAC in the same year. His own description of the artwork for the WAC reads, "The painting is an attempt to give the sense of an aerial battle in operation over a wide area, and thus summarises England's great aerial victory over Germany. The scene includes certain elements constant during the Battle of Britain, the river winding from the town and across parched country down to the sea. Beyond, the shores of the continent. Above, the mounting cumulus concentrating at sunset after a hot, brilliant day. Across the spaces of sky, trails of airplanes, smoke tracks of dead or damaged machines falling, floating clouds, parachutes, balloons. Against the approaching twilight, new formations of Luftwaffe threatening." Nash presents a scene which mimics the scale of the Battle of Britain. The long intersecting contrails of Allied and Axis aircraft reach out across the sky like an octopus stretching its tentacles. And these twists and turns are reflected below in Nash's depiction of the Thames estuary leading into the English Channel. These curvilinear trails cause a sense of chaos in the painting, reinforcing the foreboding nature of the incoming wave of Luftwaffe aircraft, which is regimented and yet unbroken. This was a battle which would not last a day, but several months. Whilst many artists chose to reflect what those on the ground could see of the Battle of Britain in their artwork, others concentrated their efforts on the individuals at the heart of the action. War artist Thomas Cantrell Dugdale served as a platoon leader for the Home Guard in Suffolk during the Second World War and was commissioned by the War Artists Advisory Committee to produce portraits of notable servicemen and women. In 1940, he painted squadron leader George Lovell Denham, nicknamed Uncle, who flew Spitfires during the Battle of Britain. This is the second loan from the Imperial War Museums to the Harris. It's currently on display in the exhibition. Denham led 603 Squadron, which had been redeployed from its base in Edinburgh to RAF Hornchurch in August 1940 to take part in operations over southern England. Despite being shot down twice, Squadron leader Denham returned to the skies and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, or DFC, for his service. His citation in the London Gazette on the 22nd of October 1940 reads, "Since the commencement of hostilities, Squadron leader Denham has led his squadron, flight, or section in innumerable operational patrols against the enemy. His magnificent leadership has contributed largely to the success of the squadron, which has destroyed 54 enemy aircraft in about 6 weeks. 4 of these aircraft were destroyed by Squadron leader Denham himself." In this portrait, Denham wears a red and white striped cravat and leather flying jacket, which falls open to reveal his newly acquired DFC ribbon bar above his left breast pocket. You can see it there striped. He was one of nearly 3,000 RAF pilots who took part in the Battle of Britain. Whilst most of them were British, many came from all over the Commonwealth and occupied Europe, from Poland, New Zealand, Canada, Czechoslovakia, which is now Czech Republic and Slovakia, Belgium, Australia, South Africa, France, Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, Barbados, and Jamaica. There were even some pilots from Neutral Island and the United States before the US joined in 1941. The Battle of Britain was a pivotal moment in the Second World War, ending in a crucial victory for the Allied forces. However, during those fateful months in 1940, fear that the German Luftwaffe would succeed in breaking the RAF's defences was ever present. Untitled, by Eileen Agar, is a painting which explores this seemingly relentless threat, not just on the physical landscape of Britain and its inhabitants, but on British identity and history. It is the third of the loans from Imperial War Museums to the Harris, and it's my personal favourite. It's not just because Eileen Agar shares my surname, it's because I really, really think it's a fantastic work. So to give you a little bit of background about Eileen Agar, she was born in Buenos Aires in Argentina in 1899 and moved to Britain in 1911. She attended the Slade School of Art before studying in Paris, eventually settling in London in 1930. Notably, Agar was one of the few female artists selected for the groundbreaking International Surrealist exhibition in London in 1936. During the Second World War, she worked in a canteen in Savile Row by day and served as a fire watcher by night. She was not interested in becoming an official war artist, stating in her autobiography, which is called A Look at My Life, which I recommend reading. She says, "I am not a warlike creature, and I could see my efforts to turn myself into a better painter being blown to bits." In fact, she struggled to create artwork at all during this period, stating, "The war overwhelmed me. I felt it impossible to concentrate on painting when you could turn to look out of the window and see, as I once did, a Messerschmitt flying low over the treetops." Untitled is therefore a rare example of Agar's work relating to war. In this painting, you can see there's an outline reminiscent of a prehistoric mammoth which dominates the foreground. There are ship's masts and rigging, small boats and shell-like shapes that can be seen in the background, and all of these can be seen alongside camouflaged RAF aircraft wings. The overall composition is framed by wavy blue shapes, perhaps in reference to the sea surrounding the island of Britain. This surrealist painting fuses both natural and man-made elements, and old and new, to bring together sea, land, air, and home. Now, when I was first looking into Imperial War Museum's collection to see what might be suitable for loan, I came across this work and couldn't quite understand it. It was only when I looked into Agar's life and read her autobiography that it became a little clearer. The Battle of Britain was fought over stretches of coastline, which Agar had frequented on holiday with fellow artists and friends, including Paul Nash, who we saw his Battle of Britain painting earlier. She spent much of her childhood in Dorset and would continue to visit as an adult. She enjoyed combing the beaches in search of organic material, which would influence her sculpture, painting, and collages. Now, by 1940, it was these very things she loved most about Britain that were under severe threat. So by presenting this colossal skeletal mammoth at the centre of her painting, I think Agar is posing a question. Is Britain going the way of the mammoth towards eventual extinction? And when I first thought this, it filled me with a fraction of the horror that Agar must have felt at the time. But then looking again, the presence of the RAF aircraft wings are kind of counter to this. They're a sign of hope. Their camouflage is akin to that of the land they are designed to protect. It seems that Agar was all too aware of the importance of the Battle of Britain and the impact defeat would have on the country she treasured. What a fantastic work. By the end of October 1940, the Battle of Britain was over, but war artists continue to document, interpret, and respond to events of the Second World War, which now provides a vital record and first-hand link for generations to come. Imperial War Museum's art collection spans from the First World War to the present day and contains over 90,000 works, including paintings, prints, drawings, sculpture, textiles, photographs, as well as posters, postcards, and other ephemera. And you can explore more on our website, which is iwm.org.uk.